That is in progress. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to Project Houses. My name is Sol Diaz, and I am the Joseph Coordinator and Public Arts Assistant. And we are so excited to host Power Objects, a conversation with Christina Coleman, Michael Ray Charles, and of course Tammie Rubin. This program is in conjunction with Round 53, the Curious Case of Critical Race Theory. It is curated by Danielle Burns-Wilson, and specifically this program is part of Tammie Rubin's Round 53 installation, Harmony, Comfort, Convenience. And Round 53 in general will be on view until June 5th. So if you haven't had a chance to view the installations, I invite you to get some time to do so. For tonight's itinerary, our panelists will speak together of a conversation, and for the last 10 minutes, we will open up the floor for audience Q&A. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Tammie.
Thank you, Sol. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming. And I want to thank my fellow artists for agreeing to coming as well. When they said that there's programming as part of the exhibition, I was really thinking about like what kind of conversation I would have, and these two artists came to mind. So we're going to do kind of like we're going to skip like the bios. You guys can read the bios, and some of that information will come out through the conversation. So I'm just going to start. Christina Coleman is a multidisciplinary artist who lives in Austin. She's originally from LA, but she has deep family ties here in Texas. And Michael Ray Charles, I would say, is an artist. I wouldn't say he is an artist, a scholar, and educator. And Texas has been his adopted home for a number of years now. But you're originally from Louisiana, right? Yes. And so, how I want to start this conversation is that these are both people whose work, as you look at the work, there's this air of familiarity as you look at the work. And when you look at the objects that they're using, the things that they're referencing, a lot of them are things that already exist in the world. And so I wanted to start from that place. So one of the images that we are seeing is some images from Project Row House, my exhibition here. And things that you can notice in the room is that the floors are painted with this quilt pattern from the Underground Railroads. And there are state flags, there are peanuts, there is glass, and these are forms that are very kind of like recognizable. And so in all of my work, it starts from something that exists in the world already, either domestic or industrial objects that I'm separating from their original function and then making recreations of, often in ceramics. So like, what resonance do objects hold when you have separated them from that original function? What still seems to be conveyed? What other associations are made? And how does it work with something that starts recognizable through abstraction? So my question as we start, my first question is going to be for Christina, but I forgot the words. But also, as you guys kind of look through these images, we're looking at the first works, which is always and forever. And these home forms are made from everything from safety cones, caution cones, funnels, catering plastic, snow cone holders. And so when they come here, the comical form starts to reference a number of things. And so what we're looking at on my right is the Ku Klux Klan, and then on the left is the Brothers of the Nazarene, the Capoeira, which is a festival that takes place in Brazil and also in places in Spain as well. So one week, Holy Week. And one thing that you can see is like these are similar costumes, these are similar hoods, right? So this idea of like, where do things come from? How are they repeated? And how does the context change when, like, how do you change the context depending on who's wearing it, what is its purpose, so on and so forth. Other things that I'm looking at are things like African and indigenous headdresses. Thinking about this idea of pageantry, like why do we wear things that make us both seem powerful yet anonymous when things are happening within groupings, how the context changes, and how like these same kind of comical forms are repeated over and over again. The cone form as well are things like the Dutch cap, which has kind of interesting history. Originally, the Dutch cap was this philosopher, John Scotus Dunstan, and his followers would wear this cone cap because they thought it made them smarter. And so how do you go from these people wearing caps from this philosopher to be smarter to what we think of as the Dutch cap, which is, kind of idiocy, right? In the Hieronymus Bosch painting, there are often figures that are wearing cones. One of those figures is what he called a doctor, but really like a quack, like a person who is like a charlatan or an idiot or someone who is trying to like mislead you. And then one reference from the Wizard of Oz. There is a reference that is made, not necessarily in that book, but there's this reference that the Tin Man is actually dealing with kind of mental illness. There's an idea that like a cone shape qualifies as like someone who is insane. So like same form, different context, right? And as we move on, this is a piece that is being reconfigured for the space, and now instead of becoming hoods, becomes these like speaking pipes. So for communications, for what and for whom, and is it receiving or is it transmitting? Again, making something that already exists and then changing the context. Things here again, things that are made out of plastic. The very bottom portion of this is actually like a salad container. So thinking about these things that are industrially made, that are made for one-time use, this transition of taking it from like a trivial material into a material that at one time ceramics was thought of, porcelain specifically, was white gold, so very valuable. And now in our society, it's probably something that has very little value. So it's one thing that has gone on the spectrum. And so the next one is just other references. On the right are pre-telephone. They're called speaking tubes or voice pipes. And this was a mechanism for people on warships in buildings to be able to speak through before there were telephones to communicate with each other. And things like the funnel, the megaphone, all of these are cone shapes. So taking something that you see over and over again, and then making it into this kind of new context. And so with that, one other thing that you will see in the space is a collection of laboratory glass. And as you get close to laboratory glass, you will see these etched images. And so it's everything from, it routes basically my parents moving from, my mom moving from rural Mississippi, a little town called Summit, in 1959, and moving to Chicago, and then my dad moving to Chicago as well from Memphis, Tennessee, even though he was born in Mississippi. And along that way, having these markers of dates of pre-desegregation and what those dates were in relation to where they would be at these particular points in history. I think oftentimes we kind of trivialize the fact that, we think that like segregation was a long time ago. It was not a long time, right? And so thinking about the fact that when my parents got married, for them to visit their families, if they were going to take the train in Cairo, Illinois, is where the train would have changed from being desegregated to segregated as it went south, right? And so trying to place them in a historical history of a personal narrative and expanding it outward as a kind of more universal experience of 6 million African Americans doing this northern migration. And then the things that they carried with them along the way, such as like the different kind of foods we ate, the pilgrimages that we make back home. So again, thinking about America for Black Americans, you know, they talk about America as a great experiments, and I think for Black Americans, we're still waiting for this to see how this experiment is going to work. So that's a little bit about my work, but I'm really excited to move this along. And so if we move to the next image. So Christina and Michael, I would love to hear you talk about how the objects that you choose to focus on that exist in the world, how they make their way through your practice, through materiality, through concept, through abstraction. And so I asked them to provide some images of things that they have referenced that have become prints or paintings and sculptures. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that.
Sorry. I'm not sure of the order that I have my images in, so you may see some reference images as well as actual artwork images that but you can just cycle them through and yeah, so the first image that I saw was a hair accessory. It's an elastic hairband. I called them barrettes when I grew up. So that's a object that I use, and it's a power object that I use in my artwork. In the image right before this one, I've cut off the colorful balls on the ends, and I've made these line crafts with them, where I've stretched out the elastic as taut as I can. And so that piece is simply existing by attention. So for me, just to answer your question, Tammie, for me, when I begin making artwork, it usually comes from a personal place, from an object that I have used in the past. And it's usually an everyday object, something that I use every day. So when I was a little girl, I would wear those colorful elastic bands in my hair. And through a process of abstractions, you mentioned materiality, I begin to change the context and recontextualize this object in particular. And so for me, what I'm interested in is what I really like about working with materials in that way is that physicality is emphasized. I can emphasize the tension and the pulling of those bands, the multiplicity of them. And then as Tim was saying earlier, the context begins to change. Visually, they begin to look like other things. For example, barbed wire or birds on like electrical telephone pole lines. And so in this work, I was interested in statistical information. And in terms of abstraction, I've always been interested in the idea that there is all of this information that gets stripped down or gets imbued into one single object or one single form. And so in a lot of my work, you'll see that happening. And this one, the names of the word, this one is called staff. Sometimes I forget, but this one is called colorful staff. So I've just wrapped those hair accessories around this, just the steel pole, and use synthetic hair in the center. And so just thinking about how these accessories are just everyday objects, but they also speak to these larger kind of dialogues about hair culture. And there's so much that is involved with that kind of dialogue. Thinking about beauty, about natural hair versus synthetic hair, artificial hair. Do we as people, what became really interesting to me was reading this text that talked about how when you cultivate something, you run your hands through it, you process it, you use it, in that act, does that have ownership over an object? And so it's interesting when we talk about power in objects. I think these objects that we use every day, we do imbue them with the kind of power. We almost have sometimes like a not a relationship, but they begin to be kind of like anthropomorphic in that way, where we might see them as having their own agency. And so this one is, these are Oreo cookies, and you know, we all love them, I guess for me, I transformed the Oreo cookies into this piece called Black Hole Terrain. And with that piece and others, and you'll notice I work in series a lot. So I'll work in batches, where I'll make a batch of work that looks like this, and then I'll come back to it later and I'll work on something else. So that's kind of my personal process. But this, using these Oreos, I just was interested in the social history of the Oreo as defining someone who's Black on the outside and white on the inside. And just thinking about consumption and thinking about how it's interesting that race gets put onto this one object that we consume. And so if you're called an Oreo, if you hear people calling someone else an Oreo, it tends to have a derogatory meaning. And so I was really interested in creating a piece that was about parallels of changing the Oreo so that it referenced black holes in cosmic space. And I did that because I was thinking about how black holes are these cosmic entities that have always existed. We know very little about them. We're still finding out information about them, in terms of the origins of the universe, but they've always been there. And black hole is a space, and it's a space where the gravity force is so strong that nothing can escape it. So it encompasses everything into this one area. And yet we know very little about it. And I was interested in how race kind of functions in a similar way, of how it has been, it has been around as long as we've been around, but we're still learning about things like the effects of race, racism, how it operates in our society. So I made that piece. And this is, this is another work called Lunar Phases, where it's just a bunch of small Oreos that I made. And so these are, I should say, these are not actual Oreo cookies. I've made a mold of Oreo cookies out of synthetic hair. And so you'll see like hair and hair care products throughout my work. And so synthetic hair I thought was an interesting material because for me it sits in a very interesting place. It's not human hair, it's artificial, but we use it every day throughout, much of our lives and culture, some of us do. And so I was interested in it occupying this sort of gap space, this space that it's very flexible, it's very malleable, and thinking about these black holes and sucking all of this, light into it, all of these cosmic beings into it. So there's another parallel that I thought. These are some ceramic cones I've made. I made a series of them. They're like, like a 1-to-1 scale, I should say. They're like that. And I was just interested, like Tammie was saying, a lot of the objects I usually exist already out in the world, and they have a history and they have a use. And so for me, personally, I got to a point where I was really tired of combing out my hair every day. And so I began to make these combs that reference many things, that reference weapons, that reference measurements, and thinking about how the comb has been used as a measurement tool in the past. And also thinking about how to render the comb non-functional. And so some of them were kind of funny with me, and then I also used these dominoes in my work. This is like a new recent series that I've started. And so, so just changing the objects to allow for a different function, to allow for a different kind of potential for their use. And so here I was just thinking about dominoes and their patterning and the information as these potentials for like unlocking time. And so I made these vessels, these ceramic vessels, where the dominoes are decorated. But just sort of thinking about objects and how, because of my personal relationship with them, how I use them every day, they kind of have this power. But at the same time, like you were saying, when you take it and you change the context, you allow for more associations.
Yeah, and then the same question to you, Marco. I mean, I think that like. There's like an overlap in the fact that we have like a lot of our objects are really kind of trivial or mundane, or like accessible, but not necessarily, they don't put you on guard, right? They're more like a way that they lull you in. But some of the imagery that you choose within your work that are images that we've seen a lot, they don't do that. They hit you right in the face right away. And it's been, but also there's this sense of like the way that you think about how to adjust or shift or amplify these images that we're used to seeing in your own work. So I'm just curious about like a lot of these are, I don't want to say they're everyday objects, but they're everyday historical pieces to the history of Black people in this country. And they have been used as everyday objects where some of these things have become cookie jars or, so I guess I'll let you take it from there.
Can you fast forward the slide so I can see what you have and then I can see what I'm talking about? Okay, so in terms of object, there was one that was bank, and that was, comes from a history of images and objects constructed about constructed with specific intentions to, I think, cultivate certain ideas about Blackness in the minds of Black people. I think those objects, often known as Black memorabilia, are so important to who we are as a society today because the images and representations of Blackness intersect and have intersected with all the major technological advancements of photography in the late 1800s, the intersection of fine arts and commercial art, early advertisements, the cultivation of folks that were reading in the since in the 1900s, a lot of Europeans coming here, so forth and so on, talking about issues of slavery. These ideas that begin to be represented in early advertisements were coming from or inspired by illustrations from Uncle Tom's Cabin. So my ideas may have sprung from those objects and how they connect over time. But for me, I think of the objects as ideas, because I deal with more ideas about objects now that are at play in culture that doesn't always manifest itself, for example, in the bank.
And this is the bank.
Yeah,
This is the bank. Yeah. Can you go back to that? This one? Yeah. And so the idea is that the money would go into.
Yeah, and
into the mouth or
into the mouth.
Into the mouth, and then you pull the lever, right?
Right.
The lever is the arm.
Right. And I painted this. It's about 5 foot by 6 foot, and the intention was it was really inspired by a previous painting that was done that was about reparations. It was a depiction of a clown saying you owe a handout inspired by Home and Clown from popular culture. So a lot of my work and my ideas are inspired by the ideas and objects that come out of popular culture. In this particular case, it is this symbol of Black power that it either becomes this slot that, when enacted, you know, the figure then consumes. So I'm not sure how I'm answering the question.
No, you're answering it. I mean, if we can go to, let's see, can we just move, I think either forward or backward. Let's see. Oh, I don't see it, but I know they're there, like the penny.
Well,
The
depends on.
penny is always in your work. It's almost like a signature.
Yeah. So,
Can you talk about that? Oh, there it is, like, so you
Yeah.
guys can see this penny at the bottom.
Yeah.
Right, on the bottom right corner there. And that is sort of like a repeated thing that happens in the work.
well, the penny is like a co-signature for me. And, you know, after I was told that by a professor that they didn't like it to take it out of my work, I decided to question why I had used a penny in the work in the first place. And I had used a penny in the piece that I was dealing with. I was exploring different materials. That juncture, I had broken down everything in terms of how I was approaching what I was making. So I was working with copper plate and tar. I was scratching into the plate and somehow trying to see what would happen with the copper plate and tar. And I ended up using a penny in this piece. That led to the response of a professor who one day made me think more critically about what I was doing. So I began to look at the penny as which was the emphasis in the work, for what it meant within the cultural context. It was the most insignificant in terms of value. It was brown in color, or it was colored next to the other coins, and the image of Lincoln was looking in the opposite direction in terms of its relationship to currency and on the coin. And I began to use it as a co-signature in my work for a number of reasons. So that is a staple in my work. But there are other references to objects, the school desk, for example, in that recent painting. And those figures of the figures on top of the school desk and beneath the school desk, the box was down there. You know, that was inspired by, I call this series of still life actually. It was inspired by the figure at the bottom is Tom Minowitz. It's called, the painting's called Two Toms. Minowitz, something like that, isn't it? Sorry?
Is it Menlo?
It may be. He fought himself into freedom. He was enslaved, and went to Europe to fight Tom Cub, like Chubb, and he was beating the white boxer. Mullen. He had beaten the white boxer, but this was bare knuckles back in the day. So you know, he traveled away to this. So I think it was in London somewhere, and they stopped the fight when, you know, the white fighter was about to lose, and they stopped the fight and accused the black fighter of having nails in his gloves. And the white fighter, of course, had a break, and they continued to fight, and of course the black fighter lost. So it was an example of changing rules in the midst of the game. This is a recent painting, and when I was actually, I didn't know what the heck to talk about tonight, critical racism theory. This painting was inspired by a lot of the discussions going on about critical race theory, because I feel like where we are in many ways, there is a challenge to the established quo. And there is a lot of maneuvering to protect that standard, that space, but at the same time, you know, the system that has been created, people have followed in the system, and then now, no, you can't do this. We're going to change it to maintain it. So that is what, you know, actually, those kinds of ideas inspire that particular thing. But those are the forcing pieces. Stratfor Pottery, which was a very important ceramics coming into the States, because it was with what the middle class, it signified middle classness. And interesting about Stratfor began to, when Europeans were coming in to the States, Stratfor pottery was the porcelain that was put on top of the fireplace, right? They were depictions of the queen, military folks and so forth. But I found an image of Stratfor that begins to depict American pop culture, which was inspired by Thomas Darkwood Price, Uncle Tom's, and then later on Uncle Tom's Cabinet, and you start to see more of representation that would come out of American pop culture. And there was a depiction from Uncle Tom's Cabin that's pretty famous in Stratfor, and of course Melville's work and so forth and so on. But that is an important signifier of American culture, especially when one's thinking about class in American culture, and class and labor, but.
And as we think about that too, it's like the Stratfor was like there were a couple of these really specific companies that made these that were like precious items, right? But then, you know, my family, my grandmother, all like my relatives, they also had these figurines, but they were not of that quality, right? Like they're the knockoffs of the knockoffs, but they're doing the same thing. They are, you know, rendering pastoral seeds, like pastoral seeds, or often now thinking about it, like kind of offensive stereotypes about Asian figures. And I may be curious about sometimes you have these figures in the home where like these Black figures that would do things like hold mail, right? Like even in the home, this object, we're in service, right? And we have no autonomy, we're there to serve, right? And the way that these things, like these objects have made it kind of insidiously into our home. But on the other hand, I feel like that those were the first sculptures that I saw that made me think about like sculpture that was not in a museum. It's like these like pieces, right? Are there any other works that you want to talk about? Like I think that the piece that you did for the Umlaut, with the scale, it's more towards the end. It's like that large painting that's in yeah. I mean, this to me this behaves as like the cloth becomes, the canvas becomes the scale. It's not just the painting on the canvas. The canvas itself becomes the scale to me.
I tried this when I got to home. I tried to do this painting, and I went looking for sales, actually, literal sales. And that was difficult. And it didn't work. I ended up painting a version of this that's maybe a little smaller than this. But, you know, it's nowhere near. I think I changed the station. I wasn't listening to old school rap when I was painting. I was listening to Kendrick Lamar, actually. But the idea, the concept of the narrative, not the narrative, the fracture became very important in this painting. It's an idea I haven't continued to explore and have yet to really kind of finish, but you know, those were some of the ideas that came through, but the canvas was actually sold for a couple of weeks, and anything that was remotely related to the flood in 17, you know, that was in that water I put it in these containers and it was started smoking at one point. And I just put all these different kinds of chemicals and I soaked this canvas in it for some time. So dirt, soil, whatever I could find, I wanted to kind of have that presence of the feel of that flood in 17. And I discovered I read an article, and here's where the object comes from, the ideas about the Catilda, which was the last slave ship that grounded in Alabama that was recently discovered. And I wanted to do paintings about this. I go up to Rome and then it's like I'm doing this painting of slave ships and migrations, right? But I didn't realize that it was definitely connected to that, to being in Rome and thinking about the issues with diaspora, Africans coming into Rome. So it sort of meshed in a way. But the objects of some of these are more ideas, and then there are objects that inspire or.
So so in that frame, because when I first became familiar with your work, and I knew about this collection that you had, that you were painting directly from it, so that you were looking at.
Never really painting directly from. I mean, I studied those things, and my intent is to understand not only what context they were intended to focus, serve as, but I'm thinking about the psychology behind it, the composition structure. I mean, really kind of trying to pull these things apart, and that's been a thing for me. I'm looking at the different forms and different variations, various cultures. What's that common string between them? You were talking, or you mentioned about some of the things you saw, the service of the relationship or reference to life.
There's black figures that are they're about the sides, they're on their knees, and they're handed out, and they're to hold the keys, mail, or, and I'm sure people that don't think anything about them. It's like a lawn job, right? But like, if you think about it, why is that there? Like, why is that continuing to be there? Like, what is it saying about our personhood to have us as ornaments or in a place of service, even as an inanimate objects? How does that? What's the spillover for that? There is spillover.
It exists in different cultures, and there is a language. It's just exactly in Venice, the Moors, even into Rome. There are depictions of blacks as servants. Now, how these concepts are taken over time and applied is another story. But we could also think about the influences of other things happening. The enslavement of black bodies and concepts associated with black bodies being less than and not equal to. So therefore, you can pick, a group of people however you choose to. And if you look at the amount of images that were produced and objects that were produced at certain times, that says a lot relative to the conditions that black bodies exist in, particularly in the States.
Well, I started to draw in Rome in 2002, and I would go to a cafe and pick up, put sugar in my cappuccino, and the package, which exactly, yeah. So basically, it looks like a sample character. This was in 2002, so like, and I just don't think that, I got bought chocolate down the street, but with no malice. Like I don't, like they just didn't seem to understand that there was something wrong with saying that.
Same for me when I was living in China, I saw figurines that were like samples of figurines or Darlie toothpaste, but they changed it to Darlie
Yeah.
But, okay.
This is all over the world, all over the world.
It's just like man changing the hairstyle, right? Giving man a curve and, you know, right, exactly.
So I want us to, kind of talked about this a little bit, but I wonder if you guys could give us some more insight into how you approach the studio, your practice. Like Christina, you use so many different objects. And I mean, for myself, when I started, I mean, I can't say what happened first, the chicken or the egg, right? Like, did I see these references first and then that made me drawn to the object? Or did I see the object and then I could see the references in it, right? And it's like, sometimes it's hard for me to like pin down exactly where it comes from, but I just know I need to start, right? And so I kind of go with this idea of like, something that's interesting to me, I'll collect it. I may not do anything with it for years. That lab class, I had traveled, flew around the state, like several states, until I figured out why I need it, right? And so I'm kind of curious about like both your approaches to like your studio practice, in terms of, you know, it doesn't have to be legal, it doesn't have to, you know, it doesn't have to be research first, or it could be conceptual, or it could be material. Like, how do you think about the space of the studio? Do you think of your work in bodies of work? Are you working on multiple bodies of work at the same time? And how do you kind of like parlay between ideas and like where you feel like these overlaps are? And like, yeah, I'm just curious about how you approach the studio.
So for me, my studio currently is in my apartment, and so for me, it's very like I have to be resourceful at times. I can't get too crazy because I don't want to burn the whole carpet up and lose my deposit or whatever on my like apartment unit. But for me, it really usually begins with memories, oftentimes. Memories and fascination with the memories. For example, like with some of my work, I'll think back to a memory that's tied to or connected to an object that I've used. And it begins with me thinking about sort of the physical properties of this object and what those physical properties have to say about then me as a person or people that use them. And sort of teasing out and drawing out and emphasizing those things. And then comes sort of the research into looking up forms, looking up sort of this idea of a color or something like that. But yeah, and I guess I think about when I'm in the studio, for me, I tend to, I'm not a multitasker, so I don't work on, I heard like Basquiat, for example, he like painted on many different paintings at one time. But for me, it's like I have to finish just one thing, unless it gets to a point where I've like done too much and I can't go back now and I have to stop. And then put it to the side and go on to something else. But usually I will work in batches where I'll create, maybe 6 drawings. And then meanwhile, all these other ideas are, constantly in my head. So I will go on to another series and then come back to this series maybe, years later. But I think that's what I forget what the other half of the question is.
Well, just like how you approach the studio space. And so when you're thinking about those batches, so we had a show in last fall, and like oftentimes I invite a piece of this. And so there were like these dominoes vessels were in that. There were these prints of the pennies. The lunar phases were in there as well, right?
Yeah.
And then also there was a rendition of the black hole, right? And they're talking to each other, they're overlapping. But I'm curious, like, how does that, how did that come together in the space, like, as you're making this?
That came together due to COVID, actually, to be honest, because I was furloughed from my job, and I had all this time just to make artwork. and so I started to see all of these circles popping up in my studio, and I allowed myself to have a little bit more freedom and say, okay, I know this idea has been working in the back of my mind. I'm going to focus and maybe make this, and then I just had the time to actually make, and once I finished it, I was able to then go on to the other ideas that I was having at the same time. But for me, it's usually only kind of way after the fact sometime, where I also, when you make work in a studio, that it's kind of in a different really space because you're so close to it and it's in your head. But once you see the work out in some kind of public space or out in a gallery or somewhere else, for me, that's when I really see the connections between everything. And then it starts happening, like you said, where I see circles everywhere now, or I see combos everywhere now. And I think like anyone said that, like you're always trying to catch up to yourself because sometimes I work intuitively where like I'm just responding to this form or responding to a mark that I can make or something like that. And
And I would say like, any space that you're making work is your studio space, right? And so whether that be like a space that is away from your home, is your home, is the kitchen table, is the backyard, that is a studio space. And yeah. Michael, what about you? I mean, your practice, how do you approach specifically the studio?
That's a tough question, because for me, making the work isn't always painting. Sometimes I'm in there and I'm thinking about, and that's as important, I think, as making. I think there are times, if I'm in there 3 days in a row, I first of all will straighten things out. And then by that third day, the energy level and the level of engagement with the making is extremely intentional, especially if it's progressive. That first day, I might start something, hit some things, organize. The second day, I might do a little sketch. But by the third day, the level of engagement is increased. And if I'm really into it, then I kind of block out some things. So it might be 2 weeks, where I'm minimalizing a lot of things relative to that happens when like you gotta do other things in life. But getting into the studio, getting there and knowing that I'm leaving wherever I'm leaving, I'm going there and it's like it's right there. And for me, it's sustaining. I used to think, like, I still do. You watch somebody like Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan or even Whitney Houston when she was at her absolute best. Man, there was just something about their ability, I think, to sustain, to engage their creativity and to sustain that creativity for a very long time. And to what we saw what Tiger Woods did, revolutionary. We see what Steph Curry does now, but if you can see it around in different forms, it doesn't have to be art. So for me, when I know by that third day, if it's at a certain level, then it's about controlling when I'm in there, shutting off everything else, and just being there and making. And I can exhaust myself, and I need a break. But about 2 weeks solid, but and then I'm exhausted, and I need to kind of do other things, go fishing and whatever, and then I can get back. But in that period of time, 2 weeks, man, I have books everywhere. I'm cross-referencing. It's like an investigator who's doing the maps, and I'm reading the internet. I mean, all of it is at play. And I think that I managed to come out. If I do 5 paintings, 5, there's one really good. I know that, right? And there's always one painting that is, for me, is the toughest one. And I don't always flip it. You know, it leaves, it's like, wish I could have done a little more on it. It's always one of them. But I know for sure, I got 1 grand slam. If I get 5, and there's some ideas, you know, I try to come up with ideas and sketch, and if I'm sketching and focused, I could get 3 to 5 other ideas, I'm good, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're active like this, the research, the thinking, the straightening of the studio, all that's happening in the studio, right?
Yeah,
Like, and I always find like those are the places, like when
I think so.
when I'm doing all these tasks, right? When I'm doing all these tasks to make, because in my process, there's a lot of process that happens for development, but that's part of it.
It's part of it, but
Yes.
for me, it doesn't shut down. I'm always consuming. I think I'm always trying to. I take something with me, like I'm going to solve or think about this problem as I go through life. I'm driving through third ward. There's something I'm going to see that might inspire me when I get back in space. And sometimes I'm more conscious of what I'm looking at, you know, and at other times it's just a different vibe of engagement. But for me, it's constant. It's constant. It doesn't always manifest itself when I'm there in the studio, but I'm always glad.
I just feel like it's always in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
You know, like it's when you're working out the problem, even when I'm not directly looking at the problem,
Yeah.
right? So it's 7:05, we started a little late, you guys mind if we do like 15 more minutes? Okay, and we'll include the question, okay, so to make sure we're being respectful of everybody's time. I think that brought up the point of like, how do you find or maintain that creative energy? And also, how do you maintain a studio career that has longevity? And whatever that longevity means to you, you know what I mean? I mean, I think it's extremely difficult to be an artist. No one cares if you're gonna make. They are not beating down your door. No one's encouraging you. It's cost prohibitive. You gotta ship work out. You gotta buy the materials. You know, it's not like a record deal. You get no money up front. You know. And so once you have made the plunge into this life, how do you keep doing it? Like, what are the things that keep you guys engaged? I mean, I feel like for me, it's like once the work is out of the studio and it's in that, like you were saying, in another space, I think that's the first time I can really look at it. Because now I'm not looking at all the other crap in my studio that hinder me from seeing it. Now I can see like how it actually exists in the world. But then as soon as it's up, I'm done with it. Because I'm like, what's the next part of this piece of this problem, or the next thing I'm gonna do, or I wish I had done this, you know what I mean? Like it's already, I'm just moving on. So for you guys, like what is that? What's the way you maintain that sweet spot? How do you find that sweet spot? How do you, like, what is longevity look like?
I'll pick this one. This is a 2 hour answer. I remember saying that I felt like I had to protect my creativity, and I wanted my creativity to be part of my life. It was something that I knew I did well, and you know, at a certain point, getting in grad school, or maybe I hadn't gotten there yet, but I felt that this world can take a lot from you. It demands a lot of you, and it takes a lot from you. And I knew that I did this well. I knew I did something well, that I could draw something, and make something, and paint something. And I really enjoyed the thinking about things and the making associations of things. And of course, delving into history. I remember saying to myself, I was taking a leap of faith. I was jumping from the mountain. The mountain was a safe place, like a porch, into this space of trust that this is what I was going to do. And I said that I would seek to live to make the art that I want. I would teach to make a living, to live to make art that I want. And then the other part of answer to that question, my wife told me that in order to keep her, I needed a job. So I say those things together because longevity for me, I was asked early on years ago about, success, and my definition did not fit the definition or the answer that the person who was asking the question desired. I think this person wanted something about, oh, you're selling paintings, you're traveling here and there, and I said, success for me is the ability to check that list off, that hopefully have the ability to check off this list in the end and ask myself, how did I serve in this capacity, in this role as a father, as a friend, as a whatever role. And that is what success for me is. And for me, that's longevity, it implies longevity. I'm not interested in temporary things. I know life is temporary, but I really believe in the creative spirit. And you have that which exists within you, that you may be asking questions now about trying to figure out how do I do this, to maybe get to this, to have this. But if you invest in the creativity, if you invest in the self, if you look within, all of the answers are there. Not only are the answers are there, you'll look up 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and you'll have evidence of really wonderful expressions that intersect in ways that you never thought they would. People say they're blessed. I've seen artists travel the world. You find artists all over the place. You got no money. In some cases, somebody paid them to go. Because they invest in their creativity. And it doesn't always manifest itself as if you're famous. I met a gentleman in San Antonio. His name is Dr. Stevenson. Remember, bought a couple of paintings of his years ago. Older gentleman. He's since passed. I was humbled when I went to his space. There were paintings everywhere, stacked high and low. He said, if you don't see nothing in here, just come out back. Went to another building, same thing. I'm scratching my head, right? And on that trip, I visited the collection in San Antonio. Who knows this collection in San Antonio? No. There's the doctor. The president of White, I started collecting all the African. Yeah, I just visited their collection, like Norman Lewis, and I had this doc space. And the thing about him was this, he just did it. He woke up and he did it. Nobody was breaking out the door to buy it. But that people talk about passion all the time. Man, he was just happy we were there. And we bought a painting, but man, that willingness to do that capacity to record what you think, how you think about the world you exist in, it's something I'll never forget. And I was a little jealous because I could never have that. It was so original, absent of all of the other stuff, that comes along with what we do in terms of values, it was like breathing, He just had to do it. He did it, Build a chair, he built a chair, he painted a chair, he built a table, he painted a table. It didn't have to be what we think is valuable. And that was really wonderful. in terms of, and I hope to be in my capacity as an artist to make a lot of work, but not, I'm not like that.
I'm gonna pass this question on to Christina, and that'll be the last question, and we'll open up to questions from the audience.
So for me, I'm just starting out. So in terms of longevity, I can only think about what I would like to see. Well, it's a lot, but I will say, I guess, if for me, just like thinking about like looking down the road and thinking about life as an artist and how to maintain a practice. Currently, I am taking the road of working a 9 to 5 and then in my other free time making my artwork. And I don't know if my life will always look that way, but I think in the end, if the work can evolve, because you talk about you make 5 and there's one really good one, and if the work can continue to evolve, I think that would be really good. And yeah, and I think there's something in terms of success. I think when you're young, like for me, I look at artists and I see, oh, they're showing in such and such gallery, they're showing in such and such gallery, and it's like I want to have that, I want to be that as well. But the older I get, I suppose life as an artist looked one way when I was in, and I think the older I get and the more I meet other artists, life as an artist looks very different for many different people. And so I'm still in the process of finding out which road I want to take, how do I want my life to look, but I think longevity is when you can, it just needs consistency, and you're able to have some kind of consistency. It's like in music where you're not like a one-hit wonder or something like that. You kind of keep producing, you just find a way to keep producing, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I definitely, I mean, I didn't have this sense that I was going to be an artist when I was younger. It felt like something was missing and I wasn't sure what it was. And I was filling it with lots of reading and movies, like loved, even from a little kid, I just like watched, like late at night, some of you guys are young, but late at night on the television, on PBS, they would show like international films. And I just watched those. Like I just felt like I was trying to find a place in the world. I wanted to get to this place in the world where I would live the life that I wanted to live, but I didn't see it in my everyday. And when I got to college, that was the place where I thought of artists as like living beings, and it was a way to approach your life. And as soon as I felt like I stepped into that, I kind of never looked back. And I felt like I had to be very strategic though to make sure that I was not pulled off my path by other people's expectations of what I should do. And I think that as an artist, you gotta protect your time. It's, it may seem selfish to others, but it takes time to make. And when I'm away too long, after a big show or something, I'm like, oh, take a break and clean and I guess like, see people and eat and do it. And then, like a week or two in, I'm like, what's wrong with me? I feel like irritable, I feel a little depressed, I feel restless. And it's like, yeah, you've been out of the studio too long. It always helps me. So with that, if you want to open it up to you guys, if you have them, right up. Can you tell us your name too?
Yes, my name is AB. It was a very nice to be with you on this. I appreciate it. My question is for Mr. Charles and Mrs. Coleman, but also Coleman, you said that nothing seems to be able to escape the grips of blackness. Right?
Oh, black
The
holes.
grips of race, right? I'm an artist, well, I'm very peaceful, but I love violence. I like to study war. And in y'all's work, I see many references to historical hostilities and yours as well. You were talking about the utility of objects, science and forms of weapons and all these other new designs, right? My question is, how do you feel about the idea of artistic vigilantism? And when you release your work into the world, do you still consider the effect that it may have on the people who are observing and absorbing it? It's art as a language, without a doubt. Speaking something, you resonate.
I'm not sure what you mean by art vigilantism, but just for me, I can say that when I release work out into the world, for me, that just looks like I'll have an exhibition in a gallery, or if somebody buys the work, it then has, for me, it then has a different owner. And I do still think about how, even though the work is not with me anymore, I do still think about what that person's relationship to the work is, and you know, why were they interested in buying it if I don't have the opportunity to talk to them about it. But I do think that art is a visual language, and visual images are very powerful. And especially in our current day and age, they function in a very specific way, to a lot of advertising. And I think that when you say vigilantism, you just mean like a opposition to.
I'll clarify. So the question that I want to say is as simple as possible. When thinking about vigilantism, at least within the context of, let's just say, the past 3 weeks, there's been a lot of things that have been going on in our country, or throughout the globe, where people are responding to other issues with hostility and with violence or with aggression. And I think that sometimes the art that you all have kind of shown has a bit of a soul, which is not entirely peaceful. And so the question is, yes, you mentioned collectors, right? But let's remove the idea of it being just one person. When the art leaves your studio, if it was able to be accessed by everybody in the state of Texas, even really Texas, if it was able to be seen by everyone in Texas, what type of effect do you think that it may have on people's understanding the ideas that inspire you?
Yeah, I would just say that the work that I make is inspired by what I'm inspired by, and people who see the work will just bring their own interpretations to it, their own responses to it. Sometimes artists can make work from a place of reacting to something, reacting to an event that's happened in the world. Some of my work, I'm reacting to some memories that I have when I was young. And reactionary form can take, can look like a weapon or some kind of violent, type of thing. But I think that comes from a place of just surviving and about how survival is. And so thinking about defense of oneself. But just in terms of other people, yes, in my work, they're just gonna bring to it what they bring to it and how they see it. I necessarily can't control it.
I mean, are they a concern in your studio? Like, I think it's kind of the essence of asking. Are you thinking about them? Is that what you're asking? Are you thinking about them then when you're making? Is that, am I off base or?
Well, not exactly. So, I can do this all day.
Okay. Well, we're gonna let Michael respond to this. Let's let Michael respond to it as he interprets the question.
Well, you mentioned weapons, and I just started thinking about what is a weapon. If not aggressive extension with specific intentions to harm. And language could do that with aggression. But it seems like you were talking about the response to what we create as artists once the work is placed in a different context.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I'll pick it up. If you think of just regionally, we're in Houston now, but let's say you take some of the images which might have been inspirational or sailboats or the hair ties, and you take that object and then you put it next to the object of the interpretation of the art piece that you make, and then let's say you move it from Houston, which is a cosmopolitan city, and let's say we take it to the rural environment. How do you think it affects the way that other people look at the issues of these objects?
Oh, I'm very persuasive. You know, I'm someone who believes there is a collective consciousness, and that's where I try to engage. A lot of my work plays specifically with iconic images for that very reason. Ideas that are grounded in and around iconic images. Obviously, the difference between many of the issues I think we're confronted with is ignorance. And ignorance is not a bad thing necessarily. It just means that a person doesn't know. If you go to some rural areas, I grew up in rural areas. In fact, art that I thought was of value, the blackest painting I think in America just sold for $15.3 million. Doesn't get no blacker than that in my book. That was a painting I saw as a kid. That was my museum. The opening credits at Good Time, the Sugar Shack thing that made its way on Ernie Barnes, right? So I was a kid in rural America, and that was, it worked. I connected with it, the movement, the exaggeration. I didn't hear the music, I saw the music in that painting. His abstraction of the figures moving was, in my opinion, an articulation of music. So I'm applying a different language to what I'm seeing. So he connected, and I think there is a collective consciousness out there, and I try my best to, in many ways, engage it in certain ways, in certain images, as an artist early on. You know, I'm responding to and taking in stimuli from early hip hop. And for me, I wanted to make my paintings related. And I felt, well, how do I do that? And I'm thinking, okay, well, the rappers were unapologetic, bold, in your face. And those are concepts that I applied to earlier paintings. Bold, in your face, language, images, and colorful in many ways. So there is a language out there. It's a matter of you understanding what that is and how something can resonate. So it could be a rural area, but listen, the world is conflated. In rural areas, folks have access to information. You know, it's not like it was back in the 70s, you know? So, and believe it or not, you go abroad in some villages in European countries, they have access to some of the same information that you have. They may not understand the origin of things and in terms of certain images, certain objects, but they have access to those things. And their engagement is defined by what they're exposed to within that specific cultural context. So, but I'm interested in your question about vigilantism. Could you say that again?
I can, yeah.
Artists,
Artist vigilantism.
Meaning that you are, there's vengeance
Your
upon
intention.
the person who's
Your
looking at
intention
the work.
on putting out, just like, you know, just like a hip hop artist, you might say their intention of putting out signals in a way that they might be trying to tell a story, right? They might be trying to change somebody's perception of our culture, of your identity. And so it can be an act of hostility to many people to have their worldview shifted. And even, you know, I'll stop there, but I'm taking a lot of time, so.
Yeah. Interesting question. Really.
Tammie, I have one question about your body's work. How do you think about the form and how do you think about the relationship of the form and the material and the objects that your artworks take? What is the relationship between the form and the material that your artworks take?
Oh, like why am I using the materials that I'm using?
Yeah, like what is the relationship between the form, how they're formed and installed, and how that relates to the material and the object, and then how does that kind of like exist in space?
Yeah, so thinking about them like, you know, like I primarily work with ceramics, and I work with, you know, a lot of other materials, but primarily with ceramics because it's something that allows me to do all the things that I need to do in the creation of certain kind of work. And because it becomes a liquid, it can be a solid, or because I can work with it additively and subtractively. And I'm also really interested in the history of the material itself, and how it is one of the oldest, you know, ways that we have created work, and that we still, it resonates from shards that we have seen, you know, in anthropological ways, but also it's like on spaceships. It's in your house, it's your toilet, it's your, you know, your sink, it's in your cabinets, right? And the many relationships it has to the idea of like not only ornament, but like function. And the idea of taking things that are like kind of throwaway, trivial, plastic objects that themselves are often made in a mold. So if you look at any of the consumer objects around your house, if it's made out of plastic, you can look at your remote and you can see a seam, right? And it's that remote was made in two halves. But where did it start? Somebody actually had to craft that first original one out of material, and then make a void of it, and then fill it again. So this idea of like the recreation, the changing it from the original form, taking it and making a void, and then filling it with the ceramics, and then it becomes this other thing. And what is that thing? Is it you know, how does it behave? Well, often it doesn't behave as the original. It doesn't have that function anymore. But it allows me to kind of play with this idea of like retaining the original, but also thinking of like the surface as a way to embed information and subtract information. So I'm often doing a lot of using like statistical, like mapping information that I actually use as a basis of drawing directly onto the clay. So I often think about the work as almost like three-dimensional collage, because I'm casting different parts or the addition and the subtraction. There's something to be said about like making work that's intimate scale, but is in modules. Oftentimes we go into spaces, which is not that, it's actually fairly new to have such large paintings that we see all the time. Art spaces didn't used to be that large, and you didn't have paintings that big oftentimes, right? But this idea is that you have to constantly stand back and stand back and stand back to see the whole work, right? And then you go forward and it becomes distorted. What I'm kind of interested in is that when you are standing back and you're looking at something and you're like, what is that? It's familiar, but I'm not sure what it is, right? And as you get closer and closer and closer, you are forced to, you are not forced, but you have to, but you have to, if you want to know more, you have to have this intimacy with your body to the relation of this smaller scale of work. Especially with the Always and Forever series, where like there are these eye holes, you know, it's absurd that people would have a sense of like discomfort, but yet the discomfort is there. The discomfort comes from like these groupings. It comes from the way that they are at eye level, and that we have these various conversations with what that form can represent, right? And so there's something about like trophy and ornament and absurdity that I think that I'm playing with between these two things. And you know, when that material doesn't make sense for a project, I don't use it, but I often find that it does. All right, I really do feel, because I don't want to, the space has been so lovely. Thank you guys so much. Please, if you have more questions, you can find all of us on Instagram, DM us. I'm just gonna say that, I don't know how long Michael actually looks, but he does have an Instagram account. Or you can reach out to me through email as well, pretty easy to find. I want to thank you so much for giving us your time. There's so many ways that you can spend it. And thank you guys for coming and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. For putting this together. Of course. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, I don't have a